Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I am Drew, and joined by my friend and co-host Alex. How's it going, buddy? How you doing out there in Spain?
What's up, man? I'm not too bad. I was just thinking though, next week you and I are gonna have to have like a drink over Zoom or something and picture that we're in Spain because we're supposed to be there in a week.
Yes, I was originally planning to fly out to Madrid and visit Alex, and we were gonna hang out in all sorts of cool spots. He's gonna show me around. But alas, the coronavirus has stopped that. I had to get a voucher for my flight, so maybe I'll go to Spain next year whenever that voucher is almost up. But yeah, that you're right. That is, wow, I didn't think about that. That's unfortunate. Perhaps, the future's not looking as bright as I had hoped. But maybe, given that a lot of people have a lot of time off and a lot of time on, free time. And I think a lot of people have been very reflective on the past a little bit too. And we want to do kind of something along those lines here at the Tonic Accord. We're going to be talking about pivotal moments in the last century, in the 20th century. Dive into some fun history, and just kind of think about, there's definitely a lot of big moments recently that we can think of that will shape our century for sure. But we're going to look at maybe some we think are most important in the 20th century. So perhaps let's start biggest, and then maybe as we go on, we'll get more nuanced and maybe the runner-ups. But top one, biggest pivotal moment, 20th century. Call your shots, Alex. What is it?
Okay, yeah. So I was really thinking about this yesterday a lot because let's be completely honest. I think the 20th century almost changed everything in our day-to-day lives. It almost changed everything in global dynamics. And it almost changed everything in the political structure we found. So it's really difficult. I was really doing some thought into this, but I am going to say number one is World War I, and it was really difficult for me, believe me. And I'll later on maybe go into the ones that were a close second and third. But I think World War I was so important because basically it just changed not only the whole paradigm of the world we're living in, but it also just made people question the old paradigm. And basically, you had militaries. I think you and I talked about this in our episode. What was it? Does war justify social change? We did a few months ago. And you had people one day, riding into horses on battle, and the next day you had tanks. This war just changed everything. It changed the mobilization of troops. It changed wartime decisions, and just millions and millions of people died. And it showed us that war isn't always glorified. And I think so many other 20th century events led up after that. Like, you wouldn't have had the Cold War. You wouldn't have had World War II. You wouldn't have had, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. You wouldn't have had a destabilized Middle East. I just think World War I changed everything. So, yeah, that's the brief summary of why I think it was important.
That's a big, that's a big one. Just think about just the name of it, right? World War I, right? Before this, wars, well, at least historically, in the perspective of history, is that wars were more pockets and regions, and maybe an empire took over the known world. But this was, it does show that like the 20th century was kind of the beginning of the global world, for better or worse. And one of the ways it was worse was you had world wars that affected people in countries all across the world. That's pretty insane. That's pretty insane. That's a good one. That's a pretty big one. That's a pretty big one. Mine, my top dog, the alpha for me is the Manhattan Project and the creation of the creation and use of the atomic bomb, because obviously it's the largest weapon of destruction that humanity's ever created, which is terrifying. But two, I think it solidified the power dynamics for the next 60, 70 years, which was the United States had the bomb, or like the United States pre-World Wars was not a world power, and European empires almost considered us just a nuisance in the new world. But World War I made us a player. World War II with the bomb made us the top dog, and the only one that could go against us was Russia, which created the whole, the Cold War, the threat of the atomic bombs with these two world powers led to also the space race. I think that and all the periphery wars coming off that, the whole U.S. capitalism versus USSR communism, this kind of gridlock and periphery wars that affected the globe, I think started with the fact that the US and Russia created atomic weapons.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because that's my number two, and it was really tight for number one.
Uh-huh.
And I completely agree with you. This was a huge event because you're right. I mean, it reshaped the rest of the 20th century, and still the decisions and actions that came out of this are still affecting us now. And yeah, I have to agree with you. I mean, because the atomic bomb, it made the idea of complete destruction and annihilation plausible.
Right.
And it made war all of a sudden go from, before World War One, you had kind of these Napoleonic wars, these regional wars. You're wearing bright uniforms and feathers, and going out into battle proud, and tooting your flutes, and everyone's yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think by the time we got to the Manhattan Project, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people realized that, you know what, like if we F around and mess up here, this could be the end of humanity. Right. Like there's it in a weird way, I think it de-escalated mass conflict, but it also created this new sense of just instability and terror. And so you're right. I think it was a crucial one. And it's interesting because bombs are so effective, but we've seen how public opinion has just drastically changed. I mean, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened, Americans overwhelmingly approved, and now obviously things have changed, but
sure.
It is crazy how much of an impact that whole situation was, and I think it went in. I mean, I think like kind of just the whole first half of the 20th century, like kind of ending in the Cold War. I mean, I think it was all just an escalation. Like World War One started this destabilization and this debt-laced Germany and Europe, and then World War II was kind of the bridge where it kind of resolved a lot of the issues that we saw in World War One, but then it also escalated them into what we now saw as the Cold War. And I think the atomic bomb was kind of that icing on the cake to a new world order.
Yeah, certainly. Like, just think about it's really obvious the 20th century where the inequality of power, right? Like you had nations. Like, for example, I mean, like the power that the United States had to drop the bombs on the nation, while there were still while at the same time there's still, developing countries that are still getting electricity, while the United States has the power to wipe out the planet. It's the true meaning of awesome, not in the way like, dude, that's awesome, but like the original meaning, like, complete awe, jaw-dropping awe, I think is the power of the bomb. And then the fact that politics was shaped. I mean, like you said today, like we're still dealing with the effects, right? The whole Iran deal, the whole thing with Iran is we don't want them to have nuclear weapons. Pakistan and India have had nuclear weapons pointed at each other for a while now as well, which is a terrifying situation. We don't want North Korea, all of our dealings with North Korea, we don't want them to get nuclear weapons. It's crazy that, like, especially, like, I think especially our generation and younger generations, we joke around about like, who's got the bigger red button and, all these memes. But I think it was maybe our parents and our grandparents that were the ones that, they grew up with, hey, if a bomb drops, get below your wood desk at school. Like that's a different reality when your school's telling you about like what happens if the bomb drops. So I think we forget how not long ago it was. People were absolutely terrified for like nuclear global destruction. Like I can't imagine living through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, oh my God, dude, fearing the complete collapse of society at any moment. Jeez.
Yeah, no, and I think the fascinating part about the atomic bomb, just the inherent creation of it, is the fact that, I mean, yeah, you mentioned Pakistan and India and North Korea, and I guess even Cuba at the time. It made us reconsider who we listened to. Yeah. I think before then it was, like world powers. Like the dynamics were pretty simple. We talked to the people with the big fist and the big club and the arsenal of weapons. But then with the creation of the atomic bomb, all of a sudden we feel obligated to listen to North Korea and listen to Cuba and listen to Pakistan. And it's really changed, I think, how we view the enemy, because you can have a tribalistic, influenced country like Pakistan where there's fears that the Taliban could get their hands on a nuke any day. And and it's just a change because I mean, 50 years ago, if there was a tribal group like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or Pakistan, everyone just says, it's in that part of the
No one
world, and
bats
there's
an
no
eye. Yeah,
issues.
no one batted an eye. Right.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. I think you're right, and the weird positive though that I see out of the atomic bomb, and it's a weird positive, but I was thinking about this while you were talking, is it almost kind of created different diplomatic networks and channels because we realized we can't just go to war.
Right. Right.
And I mean, we did see some huge diplomatic moves out of that. From the opening of China to down the road into the 90s. I think we did see positives come out of that.
No, I mean, look, I mean, it's the only country to actually use the bomb on another state has been the United States on Japan. Since then, I mean, everyone's been making bombs, but it's all that mutually assured destruction, right? So you're right in this weird way. Mutually assured destruction has avoided people using bombs and also created new channels and new alliances. I mean, NATO. I mean, the expansion of the UN to include most nation states in the world, right? All very good things, and I think those were definitely reactions to, World War II was the world at its most divided, and then quickly after, I think people were like, we need to avoid this and create these alliances and make sure we're not just bombing the living crap out of each other. Yeah, it is a very strange silver lining, but I feel like it's this, it's still a dark cloud that affects diplomacy today. But, that's kind of like the top 10 BuzzFeed version of like the big events. Maybe let's go into the more nuanced, maybe lesser known, but equally as important things. Do you have any underdogs that you think are in the running?
Well, you can be the judge of this as an underdog or not, because I think in the U.S. it's not. It depends where you're at, but I do think the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was quite a pivotal moment. Obviously, there was still racism and tension, but when this act was pushed through by President Lyndon Johnson following the assassination of JFK, I think the nation was in a very broken state. And this was the start of something big, right? It at least created the discussion for equal employment, and it didn't at least allow businesses to personally I guess repress turnout. And I mean, a few arguments I've read even from Gallup and The Economist said that without the Civil Rights Act, Barack Obama would have never existed president, and I could buy that.
Yeah, it's all it was the start of something, right? It's
Yeah.
obviously I don't think any people that takes a look at society would argue that racism died the day the Civil Rights Act was signed. Hell no. But
No.
like you said, it was the start of something in a movement that would eventually, lead to someone like Barack Obama being president. Absolutely. I think another one I runner up for me, or like a big one, is like mass media. Like kind of, I know there's not like a pivotal moment, right? But kind of just like the creation of mass media with television, the cable news channels, the fact that people were getting news instantly, right? You no longer had to send a message and wait for a reply. It was all instant. And then the advent of the internet at the late end of the 20th century, I think, completely changed society, right? I think the first working computer was made in the 30s. So if I had to pinpoint, like if you needed to gun to my head, pinpoint moment, give me a year, I think it was 1936 with the Z1 computer. This was 1936 to 38. A German guy named Konrad Zuse made the Z1 computer. It was the first binary electrically driven mechanical calculator with limited programmability. But that would lead to the computer, the PC, the things we have all the time today that completely shape our society.
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the computer, let's be honest, the computer is something that not only shaped the end of the 20th century, but it is going to completely change in every aspect, I think, the second half of the 21st century. And so you're correct. Just to think of the outcomes of such a device. I mean, it's insane, like imagine explaining to someone in, I don't know, 1945 or 50 that you can have all of your songs, you can check the news, you can read a book, you can watch a movie, You could call your aunt and you can have a business meeting all in one device. And then also the government can surveil high quality or high regarded terrorists around the world. I mean, it's
Right.
insane.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, we're only in I would say the beginning of the true potential of a computer.
Sure. I mean, now, look, now, we've already talked about this, but now that you can like work from home using a computer for certain jobs, you can literally sit at home in a chair and work, buy groceries, eat, live, socialize with people, even to a point, through a screen. Not that I'm recommending anyone should, but you can, right? And that allows people to live a very different lifestyle than someone at the beginning of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Beginning of the 20th century, we couldn't even fly. And then at the end of the 20th century, we're sending messages via space satellites to the other side of the world within milliseconds. Pretty impressive. And I think, again, if I had to point it down, I think it comes down to computer. I know that guy doesn't get enough credit. You know what's funny too is he wanted to call his computer the V1, but this was right at when the Germans were making the V1 and V2 rockets for the war, and so he was like, you know what, I don't want my computer associated with missiles, so he called it the Z1.
Yeah, I'd imagine that wouldn't be a popular name. People are like, are they going to target me with this or something?
I think my barn got hit by a V1. You're like, oh, sorry. No. This is a computer. This is a calculator.
Yeah. And I think another thing that was this is kind of more of a political change in paradigm, but I think another big importance of the 20th century that I think negatively has infected parts of the globe is, I think, the change from the Keynesian ideology to more of a neoliberal ideology that kind of came out of the Cold War. It kind of came out of this period of time where we basically had American economists and American NGOs and American politicians going around the globe lobbying, for expensive infrastructure projects and heavy loans. And, I think we saw the beginning of kind of a Western neoliberal doctrine that was meant, in quotes, to keep countries safe from communism. Right. But in reality, it brought money to American companies and just indebted these poor countries. I mean, the example I always think of is Indonesia. They were, during the time of the Vietnam War, they were also struggling with communist influence. And the U.S. sent over a lot of economists and lobbyists and politicians basically to dream up a very flawed energy policy that would be expensive, but would bring in revenue for the United States and would indebt these countries for decades. And I think we're seeing the outcome of a lot of that now throughout the Middle East. I mean, when the Shah was propped up to power in, I believe, the 1950s, that changed all the dynamics in the region. It was for the same reasons: energy and friends of the United States. We saw this through South and Central America. Assassinating dictators, putting in oil-friendly leaders for the United States. I mean, I think unfortunately communism was black and white on the left. It was very easy to say communism was either good or bad to a communist, but I think unfortunately the American response to communism was muddled and gray and really changed a lot of people's views of the United States in a negative light.
Yeah, certainly. I guess that it's just that communism versus capitalism power dynamic affected everyone, right? Everyone kind of had to pick their sides, or at least was told to pick a side.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's true.
And that has led to movements against the United States, against communism across the world. It is interesting. I mean, that neoliberal paradigm. I wonder, when we talked about it in that one other episode, if that is shifting or not. But it certainly dominated the middle part of the 20th century. That I think had a little bit of a reaction in the late 90s with the pink tide. But ultimately, these socialist states that react have not been doing so well. So you wonder if they'll go back again. Yeah.
And I think the problem is too, you have like the WTO and the IMF and the World Bank, that their platform has been based on equality and improving living standards. But in reality, that they've basically been neoliberal mechanisms, right? And like I think you see time and time again that there's so many countries in the world that were caught in the middle of this Cold War and are still just indebted to these financial institutions. I mean, like I always think of like Jamaica and some of these other Caribbean islands, that are, making T-shirts for Nike and Adidas, and I mean, also so many Southeastern Asian countries that just kind of got stuck in the middle, and really no one helped, and I think that's been one of the big issues I saw out of this was if you didn't really pick a side, you kind of just got screwed over by whatever side came in.
Yeah, maybe a lot of people didn't really have much of a choice, but it was like, yeah, it was a global thing. It is crazy to think about like how different the 19th to the 20th century like ended, right? And how much happened, and how we're all living in this kind of like, I don't know. I feel like humanity. Like 20th century was humanity at its worst and at its best. Like the most division and the most tragedies and atrocities, but also the most union after that, and the most cohesion, and the beginning to build something better. And I mean, now we live in a world with the best standard of living and best lifespan. And although we still have a lot of issues, and there's a big political battle about healthcare, most countries have the best healthcare they've ever had before. It's crazy how much positive has actually come out of some of the darkest days in human history.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I feel like the 19th century was sort of a period of most of the world powers getting their sea legs.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the chicken that hatches and starts kind of walking around, you're trying to get your bearings. And then, yeah, the 20th century just seemed like all that came to the table, and it did bring out the worst and the best in people. And I think that's what happens when you have all these clashing differences thrown together into the rink. And I think you're right. By the second half, we did start to see some positives of stabilization. And obviously there's a lot to go, clearly. But I think a lot of people, especially people in our generation, do seem to forget that, especially the people you see out protesting or the most active on social media. They seem to think that like we live in the most unequal and the worst time ever, like so many people have such a negative view about where we've ended. And I love the Steven Pinker argument that we are living in the best time ever. Like yeah, I mean, I think the only reason why we're so angry about the lasting inequalities and issues is because we've seen how far we can come.
Yeah. It's definitely set us up for what we have to deal with in this century, and certainly it is important to look at the past because history is something that's like connected, right? You can see a through line of like what events lead to other events. Nothing happens in a vacuum. It's so important to look back at history to help decide what we have to do going forward. Well, thank you everyone for this, a little different episode of Tonic Accord, but we just wanted to kind of look back at history since, we have the time on our hands being quarantined and all. I hope everyone stays safe and stays healthy. And tune in for the catching up episodes we got that just released and coming out soon. And thanks for listening.
Peace.